Hey, let's start the show.
For Thursday, April 30th, 2020. Welcome to This Is Only a Test, the official podcast of Tested.com.
Right.
Look at that fucking squirrel on my bird feeder.
And then suddenly, the Enterprise D's bridge.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast this week. Hope you're all doing well. Oh, is it just me, or is it really too early today? Kishore
It's
Hari.
early.
Is there? I have no sense of when, where, like the space-time continuum has broken down now. I'm at that stage of Shelter in Place.
It's the episode of Next Generation where the universe is closing in slowly, and eventually it'll just be Dr. Crusher or you on the bridge, and the ship's computer will say, it's just been us all along.
I'm doing a TNG rewatch with my kid who has not seen the show, and 2 episodes in, I'm watching this kind of half porny TNG episode about Data and Yar hooking up, and I was like, I don't remember it being that adult.
It
and
was
it's
fully
just
functional.
innuendo for an hour.
Will?
Everybody wanted to see that android have sex. That's all I'm saying. They all wanted to see. They were like, look, we never got Spock laid in like 3 years of original series, so we got to make this. Well, I guess one time, we got to make this happen for the robot real fast, or else it's going to be a thing.
Once every 7 years. But yeah, Data fully functional, and that was. You got to imagine when Shaban and crew were working on Picard, and spoiler, at the end of this first season of Star Trek Picard, a major character has a, let's say, android body. Everything is working is something that everything works is something that is telegraphed. Yeah, they were calling back to that. Is that episode? I forgot the name of it, where Data and Tasha hook up. Is that before or after they go to the Ryza like planet?
What's the
It's
Ryza
before.
planet?
Before, okay.
Is
It's
Ryza
the one.
the pleasure planet?
Ryza is the pleasure planet, but I don't think they go to that in the first season. I think the first season there's one where they go to basically like the yoga planet, and everyone's hugs. It's a warm hug. It's a planet of warm hugs until Wesley Crusher steps on a flower bed.
Yeah.
The one episode I really forgot is when they go to Q takes them to the planet, and he sets French Napoleonic soldiers at them, except they're like man beasts in Napoleonic garb, and no one ever tries to explain that choice in costuming. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
The one uncomfortably sexy Trek TNG episode I remember, and I don't remember which episode it is, but it's one that begins like the cold open is Beverly and Troy doing yoga and talking about a date, and it's just like, oh no, this is too human. Don't have these conversations on Trek, please.
It's not just yoga. They do yoga on the set of a corridor. They have like one part of the corridor of the Enterprise D where it's like an intersection, and there's a wider part of the corridor with like the computer panels, and that's where they have the daily yoga section. I mean, it was the 90s, the earliest of 90s and late 80s. So yeah, TNG rewatch. Are you doing one episode a night, 2 episodes a night, Kishore? What's your pace?
I don't know. That slowed us down, I have to admit, to half an episode, judiciously, carefully deployed to the child. We were doing an episode a night, but we're also doing an MCU rewatch, so that's we're kind of interspersing. I have to say, I think the reason I'm partially down is I reached the Thor 2 part of the MCU rewatch, and I was just like, I don't want to go on anymore. I've had enough of the MCU.
Look, at least you have Ultron to look forward to, so you have that going for you.
I don't know if you're being facetious or not.
I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm being facetious. Ultron aged better in the wake of Endgame. Ultron feels like a better movie than it did when it came out.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's kind of the linchpin of the whole thing. because it's when the Vision. It's when the Vision is introduced. Wanda is introduced. Like that whole thing happens, and things get like that's when the Thor's vision, which made no sense in 8 years ago, whenever that movie came out.
His lightning bath.
Yeah, his lightning bath. All of that makes sense. It's all come to it all paid off. The Russo brothers totally lassoed that one in and fixed it.
I mean, it's so interesting because Infinity War and Endgame were written by the two writers who work with the Russo brothers on the previous movies, but not the Avengers movies. Those are written directed by Joss Whedon, and yet because of the cohesion of the MCU, so many of the callbacks fall to the original Avengers and Ultron, and the payoffs really, and emotional payoffs, not just the fan service stuff, are derived from those first two films.
Well, and if you think about Ultron as an iron, like, because Ultron is about Tony Stark's journey in a lot of ways, because he messes up real bad. It's his tragic fall, and it's part of the redemptive arc of Tony Stark, the absolute bastard, to Tony Stark, the savior of half of the people in the universe.
Well, it's not just that. It's tied with Iron Man 3. It's this PTSD from the first Avengers, him seeing the universal fear, and him being, no one believing him, his vision, his deepest fear, sparked on by Scarlet Witch and opening parts of Age of Ultron, is the thing that comes to bear in Infinity War. Kishore's thoughts?
No, I just am realizing that I have to watch Ultron in a couple nights, and I'm not looking forward to it anymore based on
good.
This discussion.
It's not Justice League. It's good. I like Ultron. I am an Ultron stan. I think it's a globe-trotting Avengers movie in a way that the other ones, I think, even Infinity War, which does take you to Scotland and
around the galaxy,
yeah, but Age of Ultron goes to so many cool places, and has extended scenes there. That whole train sequence in Korea, I love that.
The Hulkbuster sequence in India is
I think that's Africa, I want to say. That's cool.
Is it?
I want to say it's like South Africa. And where else do they go? They go to Eastern Europe. I think all of that works really well. And it's a lot of juggling because they have to take certain members of the Avengers off the board. So it's not just Thor coming in for every scene or Iron Man coming in for every scene. And I think it works well.
It still has the worst CG in the MCU.
I mean, the Ragnarok stuff in the beginning is
that opening sequence is
well-treaded ground, so we won't talk about that. All right, well, let's get right to it with our, if I can do this properly.
Top story this week.
So, something happened this week. A ex-member of this podcast, this is only a test.
Yeah.
This
is the top story.
This is our top story.
Move over, Jimmy's. Move over, James. Steven, get over there.
I read.
This is a really slow news week.
I read in Entertainment Weekly that one Gary Whitta, known for, among other things, but being a co-host of this podcast,
that's definitely what he's best known for.
Somehow that didn't make the cut in the articles, by the way.
Yeah. Story credit. I know. Story credit on
podcaster
on Star Wars, Rogue One, as well as editor-in-chief of PC Gamer magazine back in the day, and writer of many video game scripts, is now a late-night talk show host. Gary has done something incredible. He has started a show called Animal Talking on his Twitch channel.
The logo is very familiar to the Animal Crossing. It's very similar to the Animal Crossing logo.
So I put this at the top of the podcast because no, it's not really the top story, but I did want to get it out of the way because I don't understand this. I think it's super cute. I watched the YouTube clip, but it looks like he's created a set, a late night set, in the vein of Tonight Show or later Sanders, of which we knew he was a big fan of. And he's doing essentially a podcast, but with a screen capture of Animal Crossing.
Well,
how does this work?
You've never played an Animal Crossing, I'm betting.
I've never played Animal Crossing.
It does not seem like a very norm kind of game. Animal Crossing lets you build a little, you take over an island and you make friends with the people who live there and you run errands. It's basically an errand running simulator. So you take lost stuff back to the other animals, you earn money to upgrade your house and make it bigger and better, and then you collect things. So you dig stuff up, you dig up fossils, and you collect bugs, and you collect fish, and you collect in this one recipes. So you can make things like the back wall of a thing that looks like a city skyline, or lighting rigs or cameras or stuff like that.
So it's a sandbox. It's not a narrative. There's no story that you go through from place to place adventuring. It is a sandbox.
It is, yes, it is. If you look at a Harvest Moon or like a Stardew Valley, it is less of a story-driven thing than that. Even it is, you are making your own story, and it's basically a playground for you to hang out in. For example, my daughter and Gary's daughter often play hide and seek in Animal Crossing because they can get in the museum where all the fossils are and run around and like explore, and it's a place for them to play when they can't be with each other in person.
So it's like The Sims.
It's the friends you meet along the way, Norm. It in game form.
It's about the journey.
But it's like The Sims, in that you are customizing and crafting, and maybe crafting instead of purchasing things, but building up a environment that is a reflection of your personality and your wants, but as opposed to catering to the lives of these NPC characters that you have no direct control over. You have your own avatar and you control that world, and then also gather NPC worlds, or it sounds like also real friends that can jump in, right?
Yeah, it's multiplayer, and you can come in, you can decorate your avatar as you want, and then you can be expressive. So you can emote, and you have an emote wheel with 8 or 10 choices or something on it like that, and you can control stuff that way.
It's a game that has met the moment. It's a very chill game that has met one of the strangest moments of our lifetime. So I think it's just sort of like hit at this perfect moment. And then at the same time, like, people have used that to create worlds and landscapes and stories that you wouldn't imagine before. I know we're going to talk about Gary's talk show, but this started a couple of weeks ago for me when I saw the Monterey Bay Aquarium start hosting Twitch streams in Animal Crossing. I'm like, I don't get it. But with that museum that's embedded in the game, they got a bunch of their museum educators. They got Emily Grassley from the Field Museum in Chicago to walk around the museum, and they would just start talking about the science of all of like the fossils that are there. And I remember so cool. Like turning it on, I was like, this seems like a funky idea, just like talking about like art of fossils. And then you like all of a sudden are just raptured by what's happening, because these like cute avatars are like taking you on this journey. And like thousands of people were watching this thing all at once. It was incredible. And so Gary's choice to go to this late night talk show was like, in a weird way, just a natural evolution of stuff that was already happening, just built for the stuff Gary is awesome at doing.
And like you said, it came at the right time. It's the sandbox. It created a virtual space to allow you to have places in a time where we cannot go to places outside our own home.
I've seen people. I have a friend who had a birthday party, like had their birthday party in Animal Crossing. Like it is opening up social, non-distant socialness in a time when we can't do that in real life.
How many people can be in one player's house at one time?
Island, Norm.
Island. Sorry.
Let's get this straight.
10, I think, is the theoretical limit, but in reality, like 9, 8, somewhere in there, depending on your internet connection and whether you have a Wi-Fi switch or a wired switch.
And this is the thing that we wish we had, or maybe we don't, but I'm looking forward to a version of this in VR. And where we talked about last week, why VR hasn't met that moment yet, because of the friction in getting headsets, and because you can't be in a space and also web browse at the same time. Where Animal Crossing, you can either be in it, or you can be watching it, or you can have lots of different relationships with those spaces, whether they are asymmetrically or asynchronously by watching a capture of it. And in many ways, it's also machinima, because when we're talking about Gary creating his own live show of an existing format. And this is something maybe, Will, you have thoughts on, because you were doing it in VR for Foo. He it's machinima in a way where he's creating this traditional content, but as opposed to traditional machinima, way back what we thought it would be 10, 15 years ago, people downloading assets, having a shared, engine and running things locally. This is captured content because bandwidth is enough that you can just capture 60:9 broadcasts, and with things like Twitch, and watch this as opposed to an Apple TV or Disney Plus show.
Well, and the brilliant thing about what Gary's done is that, like, instead of having to create those assets himself, which is expensive and time consuming and would require an enormous team for a nightly show, he's drafting on the millions of dollars that Nintendo invested in the character creator and all the character costumes and stuff like that for and the set, like all of that for Animal Crossing. So yeah, he turned a multi-million-dollar investment from Nintendo into a $60 purchase by him, and is building an empire on that. So good for Gary.
We should say the show is quite good that he's done. Like, he's run 3, like, no
so
joke.
far.
So I mean, he's run
I've seen
3. He's done 3 episodes at the point we're recording. He had Naomi Kyle on. He had Leah and their friend Tara, I want to say, and then he had Kate Stark on last night, who's a Twitch streamer. And Gary is built for this. Like, he could talk about nothing for hours. You give him a couple guests, it's like he's all of a sudden like delving deep into like your early childhood, but in a way that is like endearing and informative at the same time. His wife Leah is like almost like an Andy Richter character on the set. Like, she's like offering commentary as he goes along. He has a band leader in this friend Adam, who's like sitting there at like the band, and he'll make like band noises as they go along. He sets up clips from guests. Like, guests bring in like clips. It's incredible. It's very, very good.
It's really like I mean, it's funny when we before the whiskey sale, we had talked about giving him a nighttime talk show, like a live nighttime talk show, just for him to bring tested people on. And when we did the Vegas thing years and years ago, like, look, Gary was made to sit on a couch and talk for hours on end. It is his like, he is very good at that. So I'm excited. I haven't gotten to watch an episode because it's usually while I'm streaming, so I'll have to catch one on YouTube.
I mean, Will, you're friends with Kate.
Yeah,
that episode
awesome.
is very, very good, because they joke around a lot, but they also like touch on like, these kind of mildly serious topics. Like, I've watched Kate's streams enough that I feel like I know plenty about her, and I was still learning things about her during this. That tells you how good Gary is at this format.
And we'll be really curious about whether this has endurance. He has the endurance, and this has the legs to really be something he'll do regularly. Because the format, so much for the fun of it is the novelty of it right now, and it's going to be up to him and maybe the suggestions from the viewers to really mix it up. I think there's the familiarity of the game and also the format of a late night talk show really marry well together, especially since we're just really talking about a visual for a podcast, and the way that we did a podcast in VR a couple years ago in big screen. There's an extra novelty factor of it right now, and with the mixing tools of things like OBS Studio and be able to incorporate video and all this stuff, that makes it really fun. But we've already talked about it much longer than I thought we did for our not true top story this week, but the interesting technological implications of it are definitely fun. But the real top story, the one I did want to talk about, and I know something, Will, you've been talking about for years.
Norm, the prophecy is coming true.
I know. Well, it's still in a rumor right now, but the latest rumor, this is from Bloomberg and Mark Gurman, who has a lot of inside info into Apple, is that Apple may finally be moving to their own chips for not just the iOS phone and tablets, but for their MacBooks, an ARM-based MacBook, as soon as 2021.
Look, they started making their own SoCs. Then they started an app store so they could control the distribution of apps on their platforms. When they had those two pieces in place, it was inevitable. Because if there's one thing that Apple hates, it's not controlling part of their pipeline. And when you look at like the compromises they've had to make on OS 10 and with the MacBooks, specifically because Intel's graphics suck ass, like you think about what they could do if they control that entire, the CPU, the graphics side of it. It was either that they were going to go with AMD and APUs, or they were going to start putting whatever GPU they want on whatever ARM core they want and making that the system. And
That's one sided for sure. There's whether Apple. There's no doubt that Apple doesn't want to be beholden to another company, another big company's pipeline, and all the pros and cons with that. But there's also the fundamental difference between them making an x86 based part and an ARM based part, right? Like Apple could have invested, they have invested heavily in ARM based architecture for iOS, the A series chips, but they could have invested the same amount on x86 if they wanted to have full compatibility with Mac OS right now. What are the benefits of ARM on Mac OS, and what are the potential pitfalls?
hey, Norm, have you ever wanted to have a laptop that had 7-day battery life?
I don't need that, actually.
Okay.
No.
Well, I mean, none of us
answer
leave
is
the house
no.
anymore, so it's not an issue. But in a time when we could leave the house, imagine only plugging in your laptop once a week, right? That's the pitch.
It's not a downside. Let's agree.
Right.
7 days.
Agree, not a downside. And I also think that's too hard. I mean, I don't think anyone. I think Apple doesn't want to make phones or laptops that have 7-day battery lives. I think just like cars, yes, we would want a electric car with a 1,000-mile range or a 5,000-mile range. Like there's some impossibilities there. There are going to be sweet spots for the way people use electronics in their workflows, right? They're going to be next to a power outlet at one point every 48 hours, whether you're traveling or not. Like the shitty thing right now is the 8 hours or full day of battery life or on a phone or a laptop being insufficient because you can't really do things at full capacity for that duration for a normal work hour or travel day.
Well, so I mean, there's two sides of this. One is that the battery cycles go way down if you're only charging every few days, right? Like if you think about my MacBook Pro, which I now plug in midway through the day if I'm using it, or my gaming laptop, which literally lasts 45 minutes without being plugged in. I'm using way more charge cycles. So that device that could conceivably have a 5-year lifespan is going to have a battery replaced, at the 1,500 charge cycle mark.
Which
And
is
if you're charging,
Apple's, they're okay with that. I mean, batteries as a consumable is company policy now for their
Apple
phones.
Apple looks at the future though, and people are not going to be okay with batteries as consumable for the next 20 years. It's going to become a problem. The main benefit I see is that they'll have real 3D acceleration on the. So I guess there's two questions. Right? Where is this product going to slot in? Are they going to replace the existing MacBook Airs with this? And will this be the new low end MacBook? Or are they going to put a new, even lower tier in below the MacBook Air that's a sub $1,000 machine? And I don't think they're going to do that.
I think it's got to be, they got to make a big statement about it. If they're going to, because they have the power to, the decisions they make, people just have to deal with, both consumers and developers. We've seen this with them removing ports. We've seen this with them taking away, CD-ROM drives, DVD-ROM drives, whatever, right? Like them making these brave decisions are things will push their business forward the way they want to see computing work in the next 5 years, 10 years. I don't think they can do that if they dip their toes in the way Microsoft did with ARM on a laptop style device on the low end, on just a MacBook Air class. I think they have to do it on the MacBook Pro, and maybe not, and maybe the iMac is a place they do it. Although you don't get the benefits of the battery life there. Maybe the MacBook Pro, but not like the Mac Pro.
So the iMac is a big Photoshop machine now. Like a lot of photographers and stuff buy iMacs because the displays are really good and it has all the horsepower they need to do photo editing. So I think the iMac is probably a bad candidate unless we're talking about a really low end model. I think if you're looking at or a model without a good screen, maybe. If you're looking at laptops, if you're looking at ARM, like the big problem is Creative Suite. If Adobe doesn't bring an ARM version over that's performant, which they have had trouble making ARM versions of their apps for the last 10 years, I think they have to focus on a machine that's mainly used for web browsing and apps, and that's like entry level MacBook Airs, not
I don't
MacBook Pros,
think
not
I
iMacs.
I don't think so. I think just like when they did the 12-inch MacBook, and just like when they did the first MacBook Air, it's going to be an expensive device because they're going to say 2-day battery life. Maybe 3. I can't imagine they're going to say 3-day battery life. Let's say, well over 1 full day. Let's say something shocking, like 18 hours of battery life, right? Or 36 hours. Yeah, 36 hours of battery life, right? Something that sounds crazy now when you're shopping around for a $1,500 computer, right? That will be enough of a selling point that they'll want to charge $1,500 for that and not $1,000 for it, with upgrades to make it go over $2,000.
I know both of you are talking a lot about the hardware, and that's where a lot of the discussion is going to be. But there's so much of this is dependent on like re-engineering all of the software from basically the ground up. Do you feel like they are ready for this, given the announcement is next year there's going to be a Mac about this? This is not like theoretical anymore that they're eventually going to do this. This is like a real computer with this loaded on in less than 12 months.
Well, Will, you lived through the PowerPC Intel transition. How did that?
You did too,
go?
Norm.
I didn't come.
You worked at Maximum PC then.
I don't remember what year that was.
Yeah, but 2008, 2007.
No, was it really?
It was mid 2000s. Yeah, I had the last G3 Mac Pro on my desk when you started at Maximum PC.
What was the transition strategy then? If we want to give a bit of historical context,
the transition strategy was, if you don't want to change over, get fucked. It worked really well for them. But
there was a conversion layer, right? There was an emulation layer that you could run
for PowerPC to x86. I don't think there was.
No. Okay.
No, so you're thinking about the old Cocoa apps to the Quartz apps or whatever the new one. So they had emulation, because remember they just cut off all the OS 9 apps when they rolled out the Intel stuff. So it is not like they'd already shit canned all of their legacy software 4 years prior. So what they had done was they moved everybody to newer frameworks that were easier to port over to the new, that were more platform agnostic. And I mean, they've been doing that for the last 10 years with Xcode. So like theoretically, if your UI is wired up the right way, you'll have to redo a user interface layer to be more, mouse and keyboard or trackpad and keyboardable for if you're moving an iOS app over. But if you're moving an OS 10 app over, you probably just mash recompile, and unless you're doing something weird, it works. Like if you're just using their Swift APIs and you're just using their using Xcode to build your Mac apps, things should be fine. The complicated thing gets in with stuff like Adobe apps, where they're using almost certainly using other more cross-platform development environments, and then you have more work to do.
So the assumption, if they're following suit with the previous strategy, is recompile will be necessary on developer side. So there will be essentially two versions, and it should be simple enough because of the way Swift and Catalyst is integrated in the workflows right now. But how about optimization wise? Will devs have to go back more than just the surface level UI stuff? But would Adobe have to go back and basically re-engineer the desktop Creative Cloud, not just so it runs, because that's presumably a recompile and relatively easy, but that it's optimized power-wise for ARM and the types of chips they'd be making? I mean,
all of that depends on an infinity of things that we don't know about, right? So whether that works the way you would want it to work is entirely dependent on how Adobe builds their software now, which I don't know anything about. It's also dependent on how early Apple engages with them to get them on board. Like my assumption is that if this was a normal year at WWDC, there'd be like 2 panels that were buried in there somewhere that were like, hey, developing OS 10 on ARM, real quiet, like without any kind of obvious indicators in the description that like the people who knew what to look for would know to go to. And then that information would roll out over the rest of the year. Because I mean, the thing is, if they're going to do this for real, it's not something they can just do a surprise Tuesday announcement and then the machines are available that afternoon at the Apple Store, because the app developers have to have time to get ready. So we'll know in June if it's going to be in early 2021, and if it's going to be a late 2021, we'll know next June.
next WWDC as opposed to the virtual WWDC.
I mean,
that's
it'll
in
be
a
one or
month
the
and a
other.
half.
Yeah,
Right.
it'll be either it'll be if it's going to be like if it's a I can't remember when they normally roll out new MacBooks, but it seems like it's a first part of the year thing. So the other thing, my guess is that they'll pair it with, there's two options. They could go with existing size batteries and existing MacBook Air chassis because people really love those designs. They could also slim them way down and make them much more like the kind of the pocket computers that you see coming out of electronics markets in Southeast Asia
But they
that
have the
are like.
iPad for that.
But the iPad's not a pocket. Like these are. You're right. They do have the iPad for that. But I mean, if you had a MacBook Air that was basically full size keyboard with a little bit of trackpad and was still the same size screen, but in a much smaller form factor because you don't have to accommodate a bunch of battery. Like if you look at internal volume of a MacBook now, it's
Mostly battery.
it's like 10% electronics and then the rest is battery. So, they could reduce the amount of battery dramatically, make it a 1 pound machine instead of a 3 pound machine, and change that category again.
Again,
I
this
have no
goes
idea
back
which way they'll
to, when they look at user behavior, what is that sweet spot for performance and duration of use that they want to optimize for, right?
Yeah.
They want to optimize for a 3-pound device that will have, eventually a full week of battery because that's a lifestyle they can imagine forcing on the people that people will be really happy with, not even have to worrying about and thinking about plugging something in on a daily or other daily basis. We're not there yet with any of Apple's devices or any of electronics. Most of our electronics right now that run on batteries, we charge, whether it's your, maybe the Nintendo Switch is a good example of a device. You don't charge that every other night. That's like a once a week charge, right?
You don't have
A
a
Switch?
7-year-old, Norm. Mine gets charged.
I charge that like every few hours at this point.
Yeah, I have a battery backup attached to it sometimes when I'm using it because
Okay, maybe that's not a great example then. But yeah, a device that if you use regularly, you charge every second day or third day.
So my
seems
iPad
like
is like that, right? I pick it up a couple times a week. I use it every day, but I charge it a couple times a week. And I think we'll get in that category. Like I think the thing you'll do is have a mat on your desk. You just put the laptop on it and it has a Qi charger in there.
Or they'll sell a mat or sell a table.
Yeah,
I'm still holding
They'll
out.
sell a table.
I was gonna say the other thing this opens up is games, because with the integrated graphics on current Intel platform, there's no real opportunity to play anything more modern than like Dota. So if you look at the performance of graphics on the current Apple SoCs, it's astounding what you get in those packages. And if they scale that up for a notebook form factor, it's not out of the question you'll even be playing stuff like Doom and like real oncurrent games on these platforms.
Or VR.
Yeah,
I mean, because right now, the Intel integrated stuff they use, and the only options you have on the Mac side are Intel or AMD. NVIDIA, you could do, I guess, with the eGPU, but natively, they sell Intel packages on Iris Graphics and the AMD stuff, but they don't use AMD CPUs and APUs, and so this basically kills out. If this is true, it kills out any hope that we'll see a Ryzen-based Mac, which would be great for something this year because that's a 5-nanometer, super fast, great battery life, very performant processor, and this seems to be a last gasp for Intel on the Apple side, and Intel stuck on 15-nanometer, and when Apple moves to ARM, it's going to be much more efficient than that.
I've been talking about this for 10 years now almost, right? We started talking about this in like 2014, and I wanted them to either do it or not. It's time.
Yeah. And sorry, Intel 15-nanometer on the super high end on the like 8 core, and then 10 nanometer is what we got most recently, which again, great, but it's not going to give you 3 days of battery life. The other thing is Apple's Thunderbolt, which was jointly developed by Apple and Intel, and AMD-based systems have not had the best luck getting proper Thunderbolt certification, even though it is free to license, but only recently they could make their own silicon for that. And Apple also clearly has invested heavily in Thunderbolt 3 on their MacBook, on their high-end MacBooks. So whenever they do their own chips, maybe this is why the iPad Pro doesn't have Thunderbolt, although it does have USB-C. But that could have been them dipping their toes into ARM plus a Thunderbolt-like I/O, and which is something that even like on the Microsoft side, the Surface computers don't have. They say for security reasons, but Apple clearly invested heavily in Thunderbolt, so they would have to navigate that too, which Intel won't be happy about.
Yeah.
All right. That's some real heavy tech for our top story. A little bit of Animal Crossing, Animal Talking. By the way, by the time you're listening to this, Gary will have done his big front page of Twitch episode of Animal Talking, but I think it'll be archived as video on demand as well as edited for his YouTube channel.
We're only a few days away from like Reggie being a guest on this show. Like that's where this is trending.
That's why I want to talk about it today.
Young Foods,
because I want to be head of the game. GameStop's Reggie.
GameStop's Reggie Fils-Aimé. Yeah, exactly.
That's right. GameStop's Reggie. All right, here we go on to our next segment. And once again, I have to get the music stuff ready. And so, Star Wars. This episode is going to be coming out before May 4th, and we won't have another episode until after May 4th. But we got some Star Wars news in the world of Star Wars. First of all, very looking forward to debuting, I guess, maybe tomorrow if you're listening to this on April 30th, the Mandalorian behind-the-scenes series show on Disney+. This is an 8-episode series.
Behind the scenes?
8-episode documentary series produced. I guess it was all made before the lockdown, but you'll have Jon Favreau, who of course wrote and ran the series along with Dave Filoni and other directors. And not only will they talk about the making of things like Baby Yoda and the child, aka the child.
It's not the child. Stop it. Stop it.
Baby
All the
Yoda.
commenters agreed. It's Baby Yoda. Just you've lost that battle.
Look,
and also
once you're citing the commenters, this is like citing Wikipedia.
It's true.
For your term paper. That doesn't apply.
You know what? Apply. You're right, Kishore. I'm not going to listen to what the corporate overlords tell me the way I should. I'm going to type, NVIDIA in all caps, or do it the way their corporate logo and branding want. We'll call him Baby Yoda. Baby Yoda. The making of the puppet, as well as the costumes, as well as the stagecraft they use to film the episodes, interviews with the directors. There's a series trailer for this, which we'll put in the show notes. But if you have Disney Plus, it'll be available tomorrow. I'm looking very forward to that. 8 episodes, but more Star Wars TV show news because it's still happening. 2 bits of news. One, there's a Cassian Andor series, which we knew was going to happen. This is going to be starring Diego Luna, and it happens, of course, before the events of Rogue One. It's going to be between Return of the Jedi and Rogue One during that period, during, I guess, the Rebels period, right?
No, Rogue One is between Revenge of the Sith, not Return of the Jedi.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so it'll be that era between episode 3 and 4. Yes.
Spoilers. We can't talk about what happens after Rogue One because of reasons.
Yeah. But 3 new cast members announced, including Mon Mothma.
Ooh.
Genevieve O'Reilly.
Oh, really? Oh, that's fabulous.
The other actors, I don't really know who they are, so no idea. Generic actors.
Just actors.
Yeah. Tony Gilroy, who co-wrote Rogue One, is going to show run the series, and they announced some of the others. Beau Willimon. That's super exciting. Okay.
Who's that?
Beau Willimon wrote The Ides of March, the George Clooney directed movie, but I'm bearing the lead. He also wrote the first season of House of Cards.
Oh.
So
the U.S. version or the U.K. version?
U.S. version. And he showran. Yeah, he was a showrunner and created the first season of House of Cards. So he's like he took the reins from Sorkin, except, was super cynical about everything. But maybe we're going to get some intergalactic space politicking, some trade federation.
I was just thinking.
Backstabbing. Yes. That would be amazing for a Star Wars show to be more Star Trek than Star Trek, with some interstellar diplomacy.
Now you're making me long for the show that was set in the 15 minutes between Rogue One and Episode 4.
Man, that would be so good. Hey, what'd you have for lunch today? I got a breakfast muffin. It was pretty good.
Hey, that could be high concept, right? The 15 minutes of what's happening around the galaxy when hope was delivered right? Maybe it's the same 15 minutes repeated over and over again for 8 episodes, like what was in the case in Russian Doll. Speaking of Russian Doll, that's the other news. The creator of
Wow.
Russian Doll, Leslie Headland, is being tapped to write a new Star Wars show for Disney Plus. No information about what that is or what part of the Star Wars universe, but Russian Doll was an amazing series. I don't know if either of you watched it.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah, it was great.
And one of the best things, it was super high concept. It's a kind of a Groundhog Day style time loop show, but it did something different with every episode to iterate on the conceit, and it landed super well. Like the payoff emotionally was earned, and so it wasn't just this one gimmick. And so that's the sensibilities. Hopefully, she'll take with her Star Wars show. Moving on from Disney Plus, the big news in an entertainment world this week is, well, you guys contributed to this, the success of Trolls 2.
That's Trolls World Tour, I believe, featuring the McElroy brothers, noted podcasters, the McElroy brothers.
We had been speculating as to how much Trolls World Tour would make, being the first big movie that previously had a theatrical release, and obviously the studio wanted to make hundreds of millions of dollars from, but decided because of the lockdown to release as a streaming rental for $20 a viewing, $20 for 24 hours, 48 hours to view it, not for rental, not for owning, but straight up, instead of going to the theater, you can now watch this movie before anyone else by renting it. Well, we have the numbers, and these have been kind of verified by Universal. It took in $100 million, which is 5 million households, and presumably more than 5 million individual people, families, watching Trolls World Tour.
Could have been one household 5 million times, Norm. Full disclosure.
I don't think the math would work out based on the rental window for that.
Are you sure? Because my household owns multiple packages of Trolls World Tour branded Oreos. We have Guy Diamond shower gel. We have so many Trolls based pencil toppers. Norm, have you seen Trolls World Tour yet?
I have not. I honestly have not. And then
Trolls World Tour was okay. I mean, it was fine.
I thought the message was nice. It was sparkly.
I mean, it was okay.
The art was good. It was really pretty. The songs were okay.
It came out at the right time, and you know, you almost wish that Pixar Onward it came out or had its release window pushed back later so that it could have been the first one, because it probably would have done better on rental than it did going from a failed theatrical run, or at least disappointing theatrical run, to straight to Disney Plus.
I don't think it's fair to say that's a failed theatrical run, because that movie came out when all the shelter in places were starting, and they were boned by timing.
Well, yeah, a disappointing. Let's call it disappointing, not failed, right? Undoubtedly a disappointing theatrical run for Onward, based on the investment and marketing that Disney had put in it, anticipating a traditional Pixar theatrical release. But $100 million for Trolls World Tour. And I know a lot of articles are citing, well, it's already made more money than the first Trolls. And this argument comes with a bunch of caveats. One, it comes with the actual distribution between revenue share. So traditionally, a movie goes into theaters and there's a 50-50 revenue share, at least in the United States. Very different overseas on the price of your ticket that you buy between the distributor, which is the theater chain, and the movie studios. So if you pay $20, if they say that a movie has made $100 million in the US, 50 million goes to the studio, 50 million went to the theater chain.
So that means this is equivalent to them selling $200 million worth of tickets to theaters.
That's not the case either, because when they released this digitally, it wasn't a direct to consumer from Universal. It was through brokers.
Oh, like so they Amazon, lost 30%. Yeah.
20%, 80-20.
Okay.
So the math, you would have to do the math. So Trolls 1 domestically made $154 million. You cut that in half, that's the $75 million. 78 million, whatever it is, 76 million, 77 million. And then Trolls World Tour, if you say 100 million and then do the 80-20 split, the 80 million in profit Universal made is, yes, bigger than the 77 million that the first Trolls made. But that's also only domestically. And for World Tour, it was an international streaming release. And that's going to be a whole different set of, copyright and distribution messes.
Look, we live in the age where everyone does their own math. So, I mean, this is fine. But I'm not reading much into this because it was the movie that hit the moment. And so, it was the movie, the only children's movie that was available in this 2 to 3 week period when everyone across the country was at home looking for any piece of content, new content they could find. I think if this comes out in a month, we wouldn't see these numbers. So I think there's going to be a natural overreaction to this, that this is proof of concept that with a marginally okay movie, we can make all sorts of money going direct to consumers. And I don't think that's the proof is all there.
Yeah. I mean, I see both sides of this, right? Because as a movie viewer, sometimes there's movies that I would love. I would have loved to seen Birds of Prey when it was in theaters, but I just couldn't be asked to go to the theater. And I would have happily paid $20 to sit and watch that in my living room while it was in the theatrical release window. I think kids' movies, a lot of the appeal as a dad of a 7-year-old, for me going to see a kids' movie is to get us out of the house on a day when otherwise we would be cooped up inside.
Free daycare. If it's
raining or if it's too hot or too sunny or whatever the problem is, loading up the car and going and paying $20 for some popcorn and Cokes and watching a middling children's movie in the theater is something that I definitely want more than, even though it costs 3 times as much as watching it at home would.
Yeah. And, we want it as consumers both ways. We want the option in a idealistic future, an option to pay $20. And $20 is a fair price to pay to watch something that you would otherwise have to spend $50 to go for your entire family in a theater plus pay the food. But the theatrical experience is one of those few places and that previous to the lockdown, people were happy to pay on a per hour, dollars per hour basis, a relatively high surcharge for that traditional experience, that shared experience, the big screen experience. And that's where the fear is on these theater chains running their businesses and definitely hurting right now. That's where their overreaction comes into play, because
I can't imagine they're happy about this development.
They don't want you to have your cake and eat it too. They have no interest in a world where people have the option of going to the theater or the option of renting at home, even though I don't think, given that option, it would mean that 100% of people would decide just to rent it. I think there is a still non-zero and fairly significant number of people who would happily go to the theater for all the reasons that you talked about, Will, and for people who love the theatrical experience. But AMC Theaters has come out and said, because of how enthusiastic and the statements made by Universal, they have officially decided post-lockdown to not run Universal Pictures films.
So what is that? Fast and the Furious and Trolls and Shrek?
Jurassic Park.
Yeah, that's fine.
What? No.
I do think it was funny that the story starts with their press release about the success was too enthusiastic, so therefore we are now angry about it.
Look,
and that's their justification. What were they gonna do? They had a movie that they were basically about to take a bath on, and so they put it out the only way they could, and then we're like, hey, a lot of people watch this. And then the theater's mad about it? That's ridiculous.
The theater is mad about the insinuation that this could be a strategy going forward and a viable business going forward. Yeah.
Look, the AMC executives right now have literally nothing to do because everything that they own is shut down. There's nothing happening. So they're sitting there like, oh shit, this is going to destroy our business. We got to do something. So then they write a strongly worded press release, get a lot of bad to middling press, and none of this is going to matter when Fast 9 comes out because the last one made $1 billion, and AMC, which is the largest movie theater chain in either the country or the world, is not going to say, no, I do not want this dump truck full of money backed up to my door.
Yep,
So
both that and Jurassic World 3,
yeah,
those will make $1 billion, and everyone's going to come and play ball, assuming the pandemic is over and we're able to go watch movies in theaters.
I also think.
Oh, go ahead, Keish.
I was going to say the endless predictions about how things are going to shift after all of this is over are bound to be incorrect in some way, shape, or form. Like, I just wouldn't be surprised, once we get to that point of safety, that there's going to be a massive rebound effect of people wanting to go to movie theaters again. Like, they're important social places. So I think the idea that Trolls World Tour, and I say this with all affection for Trolls, is a sign of a death nail for movie theaters, is the overstatement of the month, and that's saying a lot for this month.
I mean,
overreactions on both sides.
I think about that moment in Endgame when Captain America picks up Thor's hammer, and every time I saw that movie in the theater, the whole audience gasped, even when I knew most of the people in there had seen it already, right? Like, there's a gasp and then there's a cheer, and no matter how many people I pack into my living room, I'm never going to get that experience at home. And I want to watch that. I want to watch the Vin Diesel be a stupid car superhero on the biggest screen possible with the most people packed into the room, stuffing my face with stale popcorn. And like, I mean, this is, I don't think this is not worth anyway.
God, I mean, talking about Endgame, that's an important part of like the historical context and the ephemera of that experience. And thank goodness someone recorded the audio of the opening night premiere. I've listened to that.
I watch those reaction videos all the time.
They're so
good. The one I went to, I went on opening night to the Alamo, and the moment when he says Avengers and like he about to say assemble, somebody in our theater yelled out, "Say it!" Just screamed like, "Say it!" And it was the best.
The other thing, the thing Keish said is right. Like, we're in a singularity. Like, it's not like a fun, we're all going to be robots at the end of the singularity, but things are changing so quickly. We have no idea what 2 weeks from now looks like, which is why when people start talking about reopening schools in July or, everybody back to business in June, like June is 30 days away, which is half the time we've been sheltering in place, basically. Like, we're not going to know until 2 weeks before, 10 days before, or less than that, what next fall looks like or next summer looks like.
Yeah. Well, next year it's going to be a funky Oscars because the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences made the announcement that the Oscar eligibility, they caved. This is something that Spielberg have been fighting against, and the Netflixes and the Amazons have been fighting for. But next year, they're putting a hold on the requirement that a film needs to be in theaters for 7 days in a commercial theater in Los Angeles to qualify for an Academy Award.
To be fair, Spielberg was fighting for this before the pandemic hit. So I'm not sure if he's going to be holding fast and firm to that statement now.
Yeah. So it's a temporary hold on the rules. So the 2021 Oscars, it's not just going to be what were the movies that came out in early 2020 in the first 3 months that we're gonna sweep the Oscars because those are the only movies we could see in theaters. I guess Onward was one of them. Birds of Prey. What else came out in the first 3 months? I don't remember what happened in January. Yes, I said Onward.
I mean, I think in January, Citizen Kane came out. It's a new movie. Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall. It's set in North Africa. It's pretty good. I haven't seen it yet, but it seemed like it had Oscar bait all over it.
Like that's you should put that on a t-shirt. Well, that's your live long and prosper from Gandalf.
Yeah, nailed it.
Nailed it. All right, here we go. Hey, did either of you watch the SNL, the second live recorded episode or from home episode this past weekend? It was a much better episode than the first time they did it.
From a production quality, it was a better episode. Though I have to say, from the first episode I had higher expectations of what the second episode was going to be already. So I actually didn't like it as much, but only because of my expectations. But they already have started to adapt how they're able to produce the show. It's starting to almost look like a show.
Is it
So
still live?
No.
No. It's
Oh.
previously recorded. They shoot it throughout the entire week, but you know, I think some IT department, you know, there's someone had to go place Amazon orders for a bunch of ring lights for everyone, for camera setups and green screens, because they were able to use green screens very effectively to edit in essentially music videos and whole skits. Still a lot of it riffing on the captured by webcam look for some of the stuff. They had a few of those, captured by phones skits, but they had some, I think, more traditional, SNL style sketches, which I thought was good. But the opener was Brad Pitt as Dr. Fauci. And something really interesting, that cold open looked really good. And I couldn't put my finger on why it looked good. Obviously, he had like the professional makeup, he had a green screen on, but that was shot, it turns out, with a prototype RED camera, a 6K RED camera. And the DP on that, the guy who shot it, wasn't just like Brad Pitt's friend. It was the CEO of RED, went to Brad Pitt's house and set up the lighting, set up the camera, and shot that bit.
What?
Wow.
Yeah. Maybe they're friends. Maybe they pulled a favor, and maybe they knew each other. But the new RED Komodo, which isn't out yet, and no one has, like, people who have been following the cameras business or have been like looking for footage for it. The first time they got to see footage was
Saturday
this
Night Live.
SNL cold
That's
open.
Pretty good premiere.
So is it like a $150,000 camera or something?
It's something ridiculous. Shoots in 6K. They use a really expensive Sigma 50-100 mil Cinelens. Obviously, everything was scaled down to 1080 and put through NBC's broadcast standards, not just not cinema standards. But I think the camera is supposed to be a $5,000 camera, so it's supposed to be a prosumer, but it was a way for them to flex, do a little bit of flexing. Speaking of cameras, Canon announced specs for their EOS 5R, and this is really shaking up the digital handheld camera world. The 5R is it's a new camera. It's the first in line of their 5R R5 series. So there was the Canon R, which is their full frame mirrorless camera, and the versions of that. This is equivalent to the Canon 5D whatever mark, but the mirrorless version of that. And the big deal for this is that it's optimized for shooting video. And unlike traditional mirrorless cameras or DSLRs, where if you want to record video, you have to compromise with the quality of the output, the bit depth of the output, unless you're using an external recorder, or also the crops on this. This will shoot at 8K video, no crop, or 4K at 120 FPS, and directly on a local card without having to plug in one of those Ninja recorders.
Wow.
So people are saying that this is a move, and without having like intense cooling needed, like on the RED cameras. This is as big an update, if it ends up being affordable and ends up being as good quality as all the specs indicate, as when the 5D Mark II came out over 10 years ago with native 1080p recording and Canon lenses.
That's exciting.
I don't know who 8K is good for. I don't know who needs to shoot native 8K 30p and has the post-production workflow to edit that, and also can afford the media to buy the memory cards. They have really, really expensive memory cards, because if you're recording 8K 30, you're basically consuming, gigabytes, every minute or few minutes at a rate where you wouldn't be able to shoot for much longer than, half an hour with a high capacity card. But no pricing on this yet, and something I'll be keeping an eye on.
Would you switch to mirrorless, Norm?
No, that's the
Okay.
big thing that I like. I don't have my camera within arm's reach, but my workflow necessitates, and maybe that's the compromise there, is I'm never going to be able to buy a DSLR that shoots video as well as one of these mirrorless cameras. But the way I shoot photography, I need to have the live view.
Hey, speaking of, really quickly, have you been able to shoot anything? I don't think I can recall a time when I haven't seen you take photos, over the course of a few days. So I imagine this is the darkest timeline for you on
This
photos.
is the darkest timeline for my DSLR. I took it out yesterday to take a couple pictures of a heron that was outside my house, but everything else has been either the baby or the dog. On my phone, it's 2 months of baby pictures, which sounds pretty normal for new dad, but it's pretty bleak. So I'm looking forward to being able to go somewhere and take pictures of things that are not the same rooms and people in my house, as much as I love all those things. Yeah. It's the little things.
Can you
The
do
little
walk
things that
storm, or are there too many people around?
we see so many people outside our house running, walking without masks. And so
It's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot here too.
Because we live right alongside a main thoroughfare, and it's a big walking street, so it does not put us at ease. Okay, going back to tech, DJI has announced a Mavic Air 2. So if you're keeping score, this is the smallest of their quadcopters, very popular, and the Mavic Air 2 will be shipping in May in the US, and it has 34 minutes of flight time. New redesigned controller with a new wireless transmission system, so it doesn't use Wi-Fi to get the video signal from the drone. And it has finally ND filters you can put on the lenses, which is not bad. It has a half-inch sensor, and it's a 48 megapixel sensor that's been available on smartphones, but now they're putting it on this drone, and it can capture 12 megapixel. It's a fixed 28 millimeter lens, so your standard kind of not ultra wide, but wide angle drone lens, and a 28 millimeter equivalent, and an aperture of f2.8. And of course, they'll do things like 4K 60 FPS or HDR photos and HDR video at 4K 30 FPS, which is it's neat. Where are people flying drones? Like, are drones a thing that you can see people in lockdown making better use of?
People fly over my house all the time.
Really?
Somebody in the neighborhood that is a regular drone flyer. So
I've seen quite a few of these videos on YouTube of people flying drones in big cities over the
to show the
past month.
empty streets, that kind of thing. Yeah.
The rare opportunities. A lot of people in the FPV flying community who have these rare opportunities to take their small, these micro drones with GoPro cameras, up the sides of buildings and places and public places where previously it'd be too dangerous to fly, given they're populated, and now they're completely empty. But I still don't see people. I don't see people on their balconies or on their roofs flying drones as a way to explore their city when they're trapped in home. I think there's still too many cars out there to make that practical.
I saw a reporter who used drones to show the scale of the anti-shelter-in-place protests in Maryland or Virginia or someplace, and it they showed the up close ground level shot, and then they got up and zoomed up and showed that it was like a crowd of maybe 45 or 50 people standing there. And I thought that was an innovative use of like this. The Mavic is a perfect case for that stuff because it's small enough to fit in your backpack, and like if you're a reporter, you can get out there and get a shot of whatever thing you need from the sky. Anyway, that's the most interesting thing I've seen with drones lately.
I'd be curious to see because last weekend we had really nice weather in the Bay Area, and a lot of people were going to public parks and golf courses. Like the golf courses in San Francisco have now been turned into like picnic areas, and people are kind of distancing, and I don't know how well advised that is, but they're maintaining their distance, but they're still kind of in this big shared green space because a lot of people really wanted to go out in the nice weather. But I'd be interested to see what the drone view of that to really see if people are being separated in the appropriate amount of distance. Okay. Other Apple rumor is that this year's new iPhones, the flagship iPhones, might be delayed.
That makes sense.
Let's take the might off of here. Like,
You think they're going to be
think
delayed?
it's got to be delayed. I don't think there's. First of all, we're not clear that there's going to be demand, even if they can do the supply. So it makes sense for them to delay just from a financial position, and then just the intricate supply chain here with manufacturing sites just still coming online in China is 2 months behind where they would be. They're a just-in-time manufacturer. I don't think you can be 2 months behind and somehow magically make that up.
I mean, if they're going to make 1 billion phones, they should have been like, it should be in process right now.
Right, right. And undoubtedly, their production timelines have shifted given the pace of factories starting up. But you don't think that they would... I find it hard to believe, and the Apple will have their earnings call on Thursday, so maybe they'll talk about some of this, even though they don't talk about new products, but they might talk about production capacity. But I find it hard to believe that they would completely not release a flagship phone in the fall of this year and throw off the updates by a full year, because that's like hundreds of billions of dollars in new phone purchases. And even if they, even if demand isn't there, by September, by October, the announcement of a phone, it doesn't need to be a full scale launch. It could be, they expect, let's say worst case, 30% of the people who are going to buy a phone actually buy a new phone by October timeframe, assuming that by October things are a little more back to normal. But they're hoping that people come January and March and holidays want to buy a new iPhone. So I don't think they could push off a launch by that much, because even though there won't be a lot of day one buyers, they want to build in, have a new product ready and not just the 11 Pro for this holiday season.
I think what Keish said is right. I think the idea that people, we're seeing unemployment at a scale we've never seen before, and you're talking about a company that makes products that are incredibly expensive. And I think, I mean, I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if they just say we're going to hold off this year and then launch in the spring or launch in the summer next year, even wait a whole year.
That would be a big hit to Apple, because that is a company that, however rich they are, they function based on the assumption that they can sell, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of phones every year.
But what's worse, to make a couple of make a 500 million phone, not be able to make phones to meet demand,
right,
which is bad,
right,
or to make a bunch of phones and then have to eat them because
I don't think
to buy phones.
I don't think they're going to be at full capacity, but I do think that they won't delay a launch. They can have a launch and adjust manufacturing so they're only making and have all the tooling. It's probably ready. It's about how much they want to spend on materials, or the materials they already bought, and how much they want to actually spend in making. Maybe they only make half the number of phones or a quarter of the number of phones.
We're talking about this as an all or nothing proposition. I mean, they launch usually 3 phones at this at this announcement. What if they just scale back to something that was 5-7 years ago? They just announced one thing, and that might actually be more kind of more fitting to the moment. And then all of a sudden, I don't know the intricacies of supply of the supply chain management of going from 3 products to 1, if that changes any of the calculations here, but I would think so. So I think we're going to see some medium things where the tone of the announcement's going to be different, and then it'll just be scaled back. But I don't think they're going to do nothing before the end of the year, because they will want to keep the cadence to a certain extent. But it just, I just don't see them doing much on the high end stuff this year.
Their SE sale, I'm sure they're looking at SE sales as versus their projections as a bellwether to see what they should do. And
SE is something that's been reviewed incredibly well, right? People are saying, iPhone users, iPhone reviewers, and Android reviewers saying that for $400, you can't get a better phone for $400. And yes, it's not a flagship phone. It doesn't tap into that premium market that Apple relies so much on for people who want to spend $1,000 or more for a prestige product. But if this phone, which has been so reviewed and should be right for the moment for people looking for new phones and not want to spend $1,000, if the SE isn't doing well from a sales point, that could be a big bellwether for them needing to adjust their supply.
Yep.
Speaking of the SE, the Halide app. Is that how it's pronounced? Halide?
Halide.
Halide.
Yeah.
Is it halide, the chemical?
I assume
It's
halide. That's how
halide
you
as
say
a
the
chemical, but it's
I
an
think it's
app.
halide.
They call it whatever they
want. It could be
want. Right?
Halliday. It could
No,
be
it's
Halide. Halido.
I've
Maybe
been known
it's
to
a silent
mispronounce
A.
this. The
Halide.
Halide camera app. I think I've called it Halide in the past. Halide app, which is a really great camera app, and the creators have done really interesting technology deep dives into the camera systems of new iPhones. Did a similar deep dive into the portrait mode of the new iPhone SE. The iPhone SE does not have Face ID, nor does it have multiple lenses in the back, so it can't do that. The two camera based depth mapping. Nor does it have the kind of focus sensors on a single lens that the iPhone XR did to do a depth map. Instead, it creates a depth map for portrait mode based purely on machine learning. And so you take a picture of a human subject, and that's why it's only humans only, natively on the iPhone, but it recognizes a person in frame based on all the training, machine learning training, and then draws an outline and creates basically a depth map, a approximate depth map, exactly, a bokeh layer.
This is how Google did this with their Pixel phones forever.
Yes, and it only it's one of those things that if you compare the best qualities, funny enough, the best quality depth map portrait mode that you get on any iPhone device is the selfie cam on the iPhone 11, 10, because you get the dot projection, right? You get the depth sensor from Face ID creating the depth map. And even the new iPads, which have the LiDAR, time of flight sensor on the back, that is not as dense a scatter of dots. So because of the necessity of Face ID, you get actually the best transition and best bokeh, even though it's not by far not the best camera sensor. But you get on the selfie mode, you get the best on that. And because this doesn't have either of that, the difference in quality between the machine learned portrait mode and the best quality that you get with Face ID enabled portrait mode is a pretty big gulf. But what's interesting to me is that Apple doesn't care, and maybe it speaks to the effectiveness of this of bokeh, of fake bokeh for normal people just posting on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. They don't care that it's imperfect. The floor for quality and what's acceptable as quality is lowering, in my opinion. I think there's still a base level that's higher on the Apple side than on a lot of the other smartphones in terms of their portrait modes. But I think they're realizing and they're happy that people are totally okay with the machine learned portrait mode, even though it's not nearly as good as what you would get with true multi-camera or a real depth map.
Is this like YouTube teaching people that video bitrate didn't matter?
I think so, and it's the same extent. Skype. We've talked about on video conferencing. Skype has fake bokeh, and that can happen on a per frame basis. And it's that people are okay with certain things. Definitely not like when we talk about YouTube audio quality. It doesn't matter if you have low bitrate video; people will still watch. But if audio is messed up, they won't listen or they won't watch. And Apple is realizing the same thing applies to photography. There's a good enough, and as someone takes a lot of photos and enjoys portrait mode on an iPhone, I'm of two minds about it, because I think you can heavily overuse it, and it takes away from a lot of the quality of and types of images and diversity of images you can take. Do you guys default to portrait?
No, it's too slow on my 10.
That's the other thing, the processing time. Yeah. The best thing I think that can come out of the new iPhones is portrait mode on a wider angle lens.
Being able to get up closer and have a full frame headshot versus being like 3 feet away and having shoulders up is
Yes.
the photo I want the portrait mode to give me.
Yes. And also, if you compare that to the type of bokeh you get on a traditional, the physics of an optical lens, you get natural bokeh when you have a telephoto, right? If you're shooting a 50 mil lens, which is what the 2x zoom is on most cameras, you're going to get a certain amount of bokeh. To have that depth on a wider lens actually requires a wider aperture, and so it's simulating something that's harder to do when you have portrait mode on a standard 35 mil or 28 mil lens. We're gonna get through the rest of the tech news relatively quickly. Did you know that Valve had a code leak last week?
I heard you're not supposed to log into TF2 or CS:GO servers, or else your computer might be owned.
That was the big scary fear. But Valve has come out and said that users should have nothing to fear, and that they did confirm that the leak was legitimate and was code from a 2017 build of the game. And for TF2, it was code from a 2011 version of the game when it was tied to the Counter-Strike Go code. But they said their quote is that they have not found any reason for players to be alarmed or to avoid the current builds, and they're continuing to investigate the situation, which they posted on Twitter. So people are still playing it. I think there's a lot of, servers went down because they said that they were vulnerable to people taking over their servers, but it's kind of scary.
Seems like it's back now.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing they said was this was a leak that they had known about since 2017 or 2018, I think, right? So it's not like it's new; it's just more public now.
Yeah. And the fact that it went to some servers and screenshots went around social media showing what would happen when messages were popping up that they didn't expect, that caused a little bit of a panic.
Your Team Fortress has been infected with the virus. Press OK to get live antivirus help now.
Well, that's why you got to play games through a web browser, Will, so you're not actually installing anything on your computer.
Oh man, that sounds so good.
Yeah, I wish.
Why would I not want to do that?
I know. Stadia, that's still a thing, right?
Yeah, it's anybody can say. You don't have to buy a Premier Pass or Super Pass or whatever now to play. You can just play. I installed it. I set it up yesterday.
You can just play 1080, 30 FPS, 60 FPS, I think even.
4K maybe? I don't know.
You have to pay for 4K. Although they're doing some free months of free pass. But Stadia, which is Google's, that's not called a console, but streaming game service, announced that they have partnered with EA. So they're getting some EA games. Madden will be in FIFA, and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order will launch on Stadia. And they also have, for your interest, PUBG.
PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Yeah, I played it around last night to see what it was like.
How's it?
So how does it work with a shooter? And because any bit of latency is going to F up that game.
Well, so
I mean, I know it's still in beta, so let's hold on.
Early access, Quiche.
Yeah.
Get the language right. So I played PUBG on both GeForce Now, which is the thing that hooks into your Steam account and uses the games that you own on Steam, and then puts you against the Steam player base, and Stadia now. The Stadia, I think the Stadia code base is based on the console versions. I'm not 100%.
But it has the cross-platform of that.
It does not have the cross-platform. There is no cross-platform that I saw. You were playing with other Stadia people.
Oh, shit. Okay.
So when I logged in, it may be cross-platform eventually. I don't know. And it may be that they do the thing that they do on the mobile games a lot, where they give you a couple of bot matches to play first. And then once they have assessed your relative skill level, they start putting you in the real player base. I literally played one game and killed 14 people and won. They were 100% all bots. Like, some of them were pre-firing around corners to let me know that they were there, so I'd be ready to shoot them. But it was interesting. So compared to GeForce Now, the Stadia version felt a little more floaty in the controls, and I don't know if that's a frame rate thing, because the GeForce Now I had the premium deal that gave me the higher frame rate, and if this was only running at 30 hertz and interpolating mouse, that would explain that maybe. The weird thing about shooters is you're trading video lag for distance lag, presumably, right? Like if the Stadia rendering clusters are set up physically closer to the server than you are, then you may have a really low ping from the client to the server, and then you have an extra 20, 50 milliseconds of latency on the video side to you.
What did you prefer? What would you prefer?
I don't know. I haven't spent enough time with it to know. If the Stadia version, so the Stadia version asks you up front if you're going to play with a gamepad or with a keyboard, and you lock that in, and then you're paired with other people who are playing on the same controls, because it would be unjust to make console gamepad people play PUBG against people with mouse and keyboard. I'm going to spend some more time with it just because I'm curious. It in both cases, I would say it has not been as bad as I was expecting. Like the GeForce Now, when I played it on GeForce Now, I was dumped into the PC pool with people who are at my skill level because it's on my account, and I immediately domed some guy with a bolt action rifle, which is hard to do on the desktop PC client. So, I wouldn't discount it. I don't know that the Stadia version is particularly good, just because of the player. I don't know if they don't cross play with console players. Like for example, the queues weren't popping on the Stadia version at all. They didn't even give you the option to play a squad first person game, 4-player first person game. You could play squad first person solos or third person solos or squads. There were no duos available, and this was with bot matches. So, I'll see how that goes, but it's interesting. And worked better than expected.
Well, that's I mean, if you have an account and you've purchased already, it means that you're able to play it on a laptop, right? A non-gaming
or your
laptop.
phone, even presumably, if you don't want to use a gamepad. The big question I have is about player base, because all of these battle royales require an enormous player base in order to get games anytime you want to play a game, and if they're not cross matching with PS4 and Xbox, and they're limiting the mouse and keyboard people to only playing with other mouse and keyboard Stadia people, there's going to be no games. So why bother?
Well, they'll just fill it with bots then, right? Which is not fun.
Look, Kishore, they were standing in the field. I eventually just got in a buggy and just started running them over because they couldn't hit me while I was driving up to them, and it was way faster to finish the game. So,
as our battle royale style game expert, I also need you to tell me about Valorant. Is that a battle royale style game?
Valorant is not a battle royale style game.
What is it?
Are you familiar with a game called Counter-Strike?
Yes.
Are you familiar with a game called Overwatch?
Familiar, yes, and
Okay.
I know of.
So Counter-Strike is a fast-paced, like pixel accurate, snap for the headshots kind of old school video game as shooter. Overwatch is a character shooter, so it's kind of like TF2.
Yep.
In that you have characters that have specific abilities, and like character specific weapons. Valorant takes the buy round and shooting mechanics of Counter-Strike and pairs it with like an ultimate style powers that you have from Overwatch characters, and you can and mashes them up in a pretty compelling way. It's made by Riot, the people who make League of Legends and Teamfight Tactics. And it is a very, very fast-paced, I think 5v5 round-based with buy rounds and the whole thing, Counter-Strike like shooter. Basically, you have to go. You're either defending the spot where they want to place the bombs, or you're placing the bomb, and you have to. I think it's first to 13 wins in a game, first 13 round wins. So
very fast. Then
it is a round takes probably a whole game probably takes 45 minutes would be my guess, because of the 13 round thing. Each round is 3 to 5 minutes at the outside, and they're very tense, but they're not tense in the same way that, like, hiding in a bathroom in PUBG for 45 minutes while you're hoping the circle lands on you is. It's a little bit of a different feel.
You have to like the old Counter-Strike style games though for this to. I tried it and I found the pace after not playing Counter-Strike in forever to be hard to get adjusted to. But if you like those types of games, I think there's something here.
It's for aim monsters. Like it is for people who are good at putting the mouse cursor on the people's heads and clicking. There's a scout equivalent. There's an op equivalent. The op is a sniper rifle that if you hit one pixel of the person, they just drop dead. But the power is at an interesting twist, because you can, like, it gives you area control and denial, and things like that. There are support classes that can heal and gives people who aren't necessarily, like the secret of Team Fortress and Overwatch is that the addition of classes, and Battlefield for that matter, the addition of classes gives people who aren't necessarily aim monsters something to do in those games that feels like it's constructive and contributing. And this adds a little bit of that, although you still kind of need to be an aim monster, I think.
All right. And this is exactly the kind of game that I wish was on a Stadia-like platform where I could try without having to download, invest, and then if I like it, then it's free to play. Then I'll continue playing it on that platform.
It is not a so it is a game that is designed to run at multiple hundreds of frames per second on today's hardware. Like it runs like Counter-Strike or whatever. It is not a 60 or 120 hertz game. It is a 400 hertz game. So
144 minimum.
Yeah, it'll run on everything you have. You don't have to worry about it. It'll take 10 minutes to download. It's not a big deal.
It's why 60 hertz was trending on Twitter yesterday. I think that was a Fortnite thing. People were pissed off about auto aim.
Oh, is Fortnite locked on 60 hertz?
There's some auto aim thing. I don't pretend to know. I just saw it pop up and I was like, oh, is this about monitors? Nope. It was about Fortnite.
Oh,
and that's why I'm old. All right, here we
60
go.
Hertz is the number one Fortnite streamer.
Moment of science.
I apologize for using the same audio cue, miscue as last time. Surely you have news that matches the tone of that intro, right?
I'm going to find the source file for that jaunty moment of science intro and just delete it from the entire internet. I'm going to burn it out as Vision did to Ultron. That's right. I tied this all back around to Age of Ultron.
Callback.
Just a couple notes on talking about antibody testing, which I talked about a lot last week. There was an analysis that came out of Alex Marston's lab at a UCSF where they looked at all of the antibody tests, or a majority of antibody tests that are on the market, and there are a lot of them, and put their analysis of the sensitivity, specificity, basically how accurate these tests are, and what the ranges on that accuracy is, all together for people to see. They were doing confirmation tests via PCR, which is the majority method that we use for testing right now. And what they found is a lot of tests are bad. I know that's a real technical term here, but
Shocking.
A lot of the antibody tests just don't work as prescribed. But the ones that do work well, and they can work fast. But there needs to be some additional refinement on some of the processes around them. So there's optimism, but at the same time caution about just the sheer kind of landscape of antibody testing right now. And this is backed up by a lot of journalistic reporting as well. And so I'll try to put a link to the I'll put a link to that site that you can see the actual analysis of the different antibody tests. Yesterday in the U.S., from when we're recording this, we officially passed 1 million cases, 1 million positive tests. It was 49 days from 1,000 to 1 million, and so in this time it sounds like a long time, but that is an exceptional growth rate. So I just want to acknowledge the weight of that, because we know there's so many more undiagnosed cases beyond that million number. But I think it carried some weight to me, knowing that we passed this mark. I want to talk about the death tolls, because I had this conversation with Alexis Madrigal last week. And it's up on YouTube and out as a podcast. And he runs a site called COVID Tracking Project, where they look at the state-by-state reporting on all the test data, positives, negatives. They do an analysis and clean up the data. This is the kind of thing that we kind of expected government to do, but right now it's in the hands of a lot of journalists and volunteers doing this. And we were talking about the death rates, and And we think, like, for the longest time, I thought of all the numbers we're getting reported, positives, negatives, which all have uncertainties to them. I thought death is the number that we could always just say, like, this is going to be true. And to a certain extent it is. Like, we have good reporting infrastructure for when people die in this country. There's defined reports that go to government agencies, and they report them out, and there's a lot of transparency in them. But why people die is a difficult thing, and especially when people die of pneumonia-like illnesses, the reason that those people die is really hard to disentangle. And then the numbers of deaths that are attributed to those different diseases becomes really gray and murky really quickly. So the CDC released data last week that looked at the number of deaths in the past month. It was over like basically a month-long period. It was like March 11th to April 6th. And you could compare that to what the data was last year as a baseline and saying, like, are we seeing an increase in number of deaths in the US? And what Alexa said in our conversation is we might need to look at this kind of methodology where we compare to a baseline, compare to the increase, and just say a lot of this is due to COVID, or a high proportion, which is exactly what we do in the case of a natural disaster. If like a tornado came through or something, we compare the baseline and attribute most, if not all, of those deaths to that. And in this case, what they found is there is thousands of unattributed deaths from the baseline in terms of what's been reported that have not gone into our official COVID count of deaths in the US. And they amount to something like 7,000 to 10,000 deaths. So right now in the US, we're sitting on a number around like 55,000 to 58,000 deaths, but that number might actually be a lot higher for COVID. But how we count is really murky. That potential undercount in the number of deaths associated to this runs counter to some of the narratives that are emerging that we're overcounting how many people are dying from this because there's underlying conditions like diabetes, hypertension, other chronic conditions, obesity that are playing into comorbidity factors here. All of this is, I'm saying, is that our count on deaths, which I used as a rock solid thing, isn't as rock solid as we think. And that we'll probably need to rethink this. So when people are doing their numbers on the fatality rate on this, and saying like, hey, the US is doing awesome, our fatality rate is 0.6% right now, which is like 0.57 right now. That number is bound to change as we kind of grapple with this death data, and that's not going to get sorted out for months. And there's probably going to be a lot of political arguments that end up affecting what these numbers are. I think the most important thing that I'm looking for is that there's no change in how the deaths are reported. We can deal with the analysis after the fact, but as long as those deaths are reported in the same processes they were a year ago, I think we'll be able to eventually get to the point where we're able to understand this. It'll just be a lagging sort of situation. So I just want to bring up, and not that our listeners need to hear more uncertainty from me at this time, but I want to say there's uncertainty there too. And we won't disentangle that for months on end. But the long and short of it is that our death rate is higher than most countries at this point, with a few exceptions. We're seeing about a rate of about 17 deaths per 100,000, which is a per capita death rate. Sweden's a little higher than us, but we're among the highest in the nation. So I was going to pause there. Make sure you guys didn't have any follow-up questions before I go to my next thing.
Can we talk about the poop?
Yeah, let's talk about poop. So, well, what do you want to talk about with poop? I should start there.
So I saw a thing yesterday, I think, about Stanford and people in the East Bay doing sewage analysis because the people start shedding virus the moment, like when they're infected, before they're symptomatic necessarily, which presumably is a good public health, a way to measure public health and where infections are rising or falling by kind of taking a look at the waste treatment plants.
Yeah, so in terms of what we know right now in terms of viral load is that people have an asymptomatic phase where they might have virus, but it's really hard to detect by our PCR tests. Those are usually in like the first couple days. And then they get to, I'm just going to call it a pre-symptomatic phase. People have used different lexicon there, but I think pre-symptomatic is the one that makes the most sense to me, where you can start detecting the virus, but they haven't developed any symptomatic effects that we'd associate to COVID-19. And then if they progress to the disease, they get symptomatic effects, and we see increased viral load across those areas, as you'd kind of expect. Now, you shed those viruses in different ways. Most of the ways that we detect this is through a nasal swab or nasal pharyngeal swab, which, by the way, when you hear nasal pharyngeal swab, they take a Q-tip and jam it as far back through your nasal cavity as you can imagine. It'll be like the Q-tip, like touching your brain is like how it feels. You know, it doesn't do that. It goes to the back of your throat, but it's really long. And they're evaluating whether just a straight nasal swab that does something closer to the epithelial cells here can actually detect it as well. But you shed it not only in your nasal cavities and mucous membranes, it comes out in your poop. And so not just, there's been some analysis of like looking at viral load in sewage, as Will alluded to in the Stanford study. There's also been a lot of work in France and analyzing viral fragments in sewage across that to get an idea of what the prevalence of viral is. The problem with the poop test is sort of multifold. Is we've seen some early indications that you shed virus in fecal matter well after the point of recovery. So even after people have gotten essentially out of the hospital and they're symptom free, they're still shedding some virus. Like those are early studies. And then like poop analysis is always viral fragment. And so you have to be able to actually control that back to like how much virus people had. And we're seeing these like wildly different understanding of what the viral load is and per person. For a while, we were thinking like children wouldn't carry the same viral load as adults. And there was information that came out a couple days ago that say they do. So this whole like poop test could result in some really interesting prevalence studies. But we have to control for some of the upstream factors. I used the word upstream. I had like a poop pun right there. It was just waiting for me. I so messed it up. I think that kind of analysis, that's done a lot for understanding drug use, because of looking at sort of prevalence of certain breakdown products of different drugs. I think this is an awesome technique, and it is in the vein of throwing everything against the wall to understand prevalence.
Cool.
One last thing I'm going to rant on before I talk about a fun science story. So there's lots of conversation about reopening the economy happening, not just here in the US, but pretty much worldwide. How do we do it? How do we do it safely? And there's a growing set of people that are saying, like, this is a science question. We need to have X, Y, and Z scientific questions answered before we open this. And so beyond testing, which is widely agreed, we need to have like a level of testing available and a level of infrastructure for testing available in a community before you can feel like you can safely open. I'm going to push back on the idea that reopening the economy is a scientific question. I think there's a lot of scientific questions that are being addressed through this. I'm not sure that anyone, epidemiologist, public health expert, any person that you can put the label scientist on, knows like when it's appropriate to open up the economy, because there's so many complicated effects to opening up the economy that we can't just kind of sweep under the rug and say this is a scientific question. And so I see a lot of people pushing back saying like, we won't open the economy until science says that it's okay. That's not a thing that's ever going to happen. Reopening the economy is a tough social question that we have to grapple with. Like if I live like here in California, if I lived in one of the rural counties, like up at the border of Oregon, where there's literally like a handful of cases. Do I feel the same as in San Francisco or LA County, where there's a lot more cases happening? Does it make sense? Looking at what's happening in Sweden, where they actually never went in lockdown, and while they have a higher death rate, they also maintain like some level of the economy being open, in the sense of there's still no gatherings of more than 50 people, but they seemingly haven't hit like healthcare capacity in their hospitals where they've been overwhelmed. Like the whole point of what I'm saying is, like, we don't know. We live in a time of we don't know. And so for really complicated questions like that, we're not going to have answers from science in a way that's going to put us at ease. So I actually am pushing back on the idea that reopening the economy is any sort of scientific question. Scientific inputs, yes, but not one that scientists should have to answer. We all have input into that question. And for those that might be seeing like the protests that are emerging as a sign of where people are at with this, in the US, there's a lot of public opinion polls that show that 80% of the US, like 82 to 80%, favor waiting at least another month, depending on like, you know, where they are before reopening the economy. And so the broad US public still feels very cautious about what needs to happen in this time. So there's a vocal minority that feels very differently, but I think people should be encouraged that a lot of people, at least, you know, here in the US, feel very pretty much on the same page of what the next steps are.
I mean, I'd be really curious to hear what listeners around the world, especially those in maybe in Canada, where the government has different policies as to how to support people in this time economically. Because I'm sure a lot of the fears and a lot of the urgency is economics driven, and not just from a macro, you know, the economy and GDP, but also just a personal economics question. What those listeners feel like, and if I think Canadians are getting what $2,000 a month from the government. Like, how does that affect, you know, from all different parts of the economic spectrum, like their feeling of the cabin fever and the urgency to go back out there? Because I completely, you know, take the note that what's the thing that's going around, that, like, you know, the parachute analogy, right? Like that, you know, you don't take off the parachute, you know, halfway down just because it's been safe for this flight. But I don't think that's a perfect analogy either, because it's not, you know, the psychological and the social wear of being inside also has to be taken into account, and some of that can be alleviated with better support, you know, that we can give each other and that the government can give us, and that different countries are doing differently.
Yeah, I mean that the calculations here that go into making that decision, like, just vary, and they're going to vary by like culture. They're going to vary by some of the scientific data about like how many cases there are. They're going to vary just by like the political realities of the place as well. So, like, I don't know the answer to this. I'm feeling personally the quarantine fatigue set in a really big way. Like, I I'm feeling like the cabin fever, and I'm totally privileged. I have the ability to work from home. You know, we're comfortable, we're safe. I just want to go outside. Like, I want to be able to go get a coffee, and like I'm feeling that in a way that I haven't felt in the past, you know, a few weeks. And not to say that my feelings are indicative of where the country is, but I think, like, you know, in the next month we're going to see that, or actually probably next couple of weeks, we're going to see that feeling rise pretty rapidly in a lot of locations.
And we should be careful not to conflate those very real human feelings with what's being kind of astroturfed and co-opted by, you know, the business interests and people wanting to open and reopen the economy for their personal bank accounts.
I mean, that's the thing, is we're at a place right now where the daily death rate is greater than 9/11 every day. Right, you know, right now.
Close, yeah, very close to it.
We're reopening states while the infection rate is still increasing in them, which seems profoundly unwise. Some of the states never closed. You know, Iowa kicking ass up there, guys. Nice work. It Yeah, it does this. It's a complicated question. There's a lot of misinformation. You see the stories about the guy who owns a bazillion hotels, not the president this time, but who is really spending a lot of money pushing a, hey, we should reopen. Maybe think about the source of your information before you grab torches and
Yeah.
pitchforks.
I mean, death is a lagging indicator. That's like a 2 to 3 week behind where the infection is. So, like, we are trying to understand what that infection rate is, like the effective infection rate, usually referred to as RT or RE. But that number is really fungible based off of conditions on the ground. So you are looking for that number to be less than 1, because that tells you that the virus is effectively not transmitting to more than one person. So you're going to see the rate of infections go down. But you need to have adequate testing in those areas to be able to really identify that in a meaningful way. So, like, I don't know. Like, I have a lot of space for people to, for states and local entities to make decisions. I err on the side of caution, and I'd rather be closed longer than open up too early. But it's not a easy decision.
I mean, there's one, can stuff like the poop test help us know how things are going, so we know, so we can selectively open areas?
I don't think the fecal test is going to be specific enough. It'll just be another data point to inform. But the whole point of the antibody test was to do that, is to give you like the prevalence rate. But those aren't mature yet either. Because if you understand the prevalence rate, which seems to be in New York, hovering 15 to 20% based off of like certain early antibody testing, that's going to tell you something different than here in San Francisco, where it's like probably closer to 0.5 to 1%. That means the calculations are really different, because if it's at 20%, even though that's a factor difference between 0.5 and 1%, it changes like how you think about what does it mean to reopen schools again in the fall. Like what's the healthcare capacity also changes just a lot of information about testing needs and just what the feeling is going to be. So in like generally across the country, we with 1 million cases, that means 1 in 300 people have been infected in this country. In New York, babies on the
Hello,
podcast.
tiny human.
Babies on the podcast.
Babies on the
But
podcast.
like in New York, that number is probably closer to like 1 in 50, 1 in 100. That means you probably know somebody if you live in New York that has had COVID, and that means the chances of somebody that died from COVID goes up. How that affects you socially and the choices that you want to see made is probably going to be pretty dramatic.
Well, and the other thing is, the other thing's become clear as more people have gotten this and recovered, is that even if you get sick and recover, there are a massive number of weird complications that can come. Like we have, Norm and I have a friend who got sick and is better, everything's fine, but now for no reason that any of the doctors can understand, he has incredible shoulder pain a couple of times a day, right? There's the blood clots, there's the pulmonary fibrosis looking lung damage. There's all this stuff that's going to dramatically impact your quality of life. So it's not like you get the flu and you're sick for 2 weeks and get better. It's that there's a pretty good chance something that's going to impact the rest of your life, or at least impact you for a long time, is going to continue with you after this. So
one last thing before I talk about something fun really quickly. The whole flu number, like there's a lot of people that will report like this is how many people died from the flu. That number that gets quoted around is like, this is what our annual flu death rate. That's a calculated number. That's based off of mathematical models of what the transmission rate of the flu is, and they combine that with data on mortality rates that are attributed to flu. That number is not what we think the true, like, quote unquote, like counted death rate for flu is. What we're seeing from COVID is literally people being counted. Like that is like, this person died from COVID, check it on a form. So I think the flu number you see is weighted up from what the reporting is. So I think our COVID number is probably going to go up too, based on what that analysis is going to be later on, as we sort of catch up to this. So don't buy into the hype that flu, like this is how many people die from the flu, means. You can't compare that to the COVID number that exists right now. All right, something fun. Let's talk
I had to bring a
about
baby into the podcast because it was getting so depressing. I needed the uplift. It also means we got to wrap up soon.
Okay. Let's talk about Spinosaurus really quickly. So there is this German paleontologist. His name was Ernst Romer. And he lived in the World War II times. And he went on an expedition to Egypt and brought back the bones of a partial bones of something called a Spinosaurus. It was a dinosaur that lived about 100 million years ago, like near the dinosaur extinction phase, that seemed to live on land but had the ability to swim in water. He brought it back to Munich, and in 1944, the museum that it was housed in was bombed by the Allied forces, and those records were destroyed. But the idea of a Spinosaurus, a creature that lived on land and water as a dinosaur, has intrigued paleontologists forever. A researcher at the University of Michigan, I believe, Nizar Ibrahim, had been tracking this, and he was in Morocco and met a collector that had a bone that he was like, I think this is a Spinosaurus bone. And a couple months later, he was at a museum in Italy, and he was like looking at their collection, and he's like, I think these bones this collector had are part of the same skeleton of these bones that I'm seeing at this Italian museum. And he found
the actual
out that
same animal's that skeleton,
the same animal. And he found out that collector had been selling them, and so that those were part of the same skeleton. So he goes in back and tracks down the collector, and he's like, "You have to take me to where you got these." And they go to this site called the Kemkem Beds in Morocco. And he shows them where he got them, and he starts like a year-long set of digs. And by 2018, they had excavated tons and tons of rock, and it came out in a paper what they discovered, and they have what is basically an 80% skeleton of the Spinosaurus now.
Wow!
And they recreated the tail, and this creature is longer than the T-Rex because of the length of the tail. So they have an 80% length of its tail. And based on its tail and like the biology of it, they're fairly sure that this creature swam and hunted, and then also existed on land. So it was this creature, this amazing thing. I'm waiting for so much more to come out about the story, because this feels like Indiana Jones in real life, that he like went on this detective hunt as well as a dig to unearth the story of the Spinosaurus. But there's some interesting animations out there of what this creature could have looked like based on the biology of that tail. We have never seen a tail like that on any sort of dinosaur, so it's a magnificent story.
So the thing I learned out of this, in addition to the Spinosaur stuff, was that we didn't know of swimming dinosaurs before, because the things that we all think of as water-based dinosaurs are probably reptiles.
Yeah, I mean, so also not at this size. So that's the other thing. Is like, this is like a gigantic creature. So some of those reptiles that did swim, I'm not sure about like what the difference between the classification is there, but they're much smaller creatures. This thing is massive, and so I think it kind of changes the equation of what we thought aquatic creatures looked like during that time period, or at least amphibian-like creatures in terms of being both on land and water.
Jurassic World 3, folks, coming soon to an AMC theater. 2022.
You don't have to make up new dinosaurs to make nightmares. That's the lesson of this.
There you go. Do it. Science, cinema, always about coulda, not about shoulda. All right. I think that's it for the podcast this week. We're going to skip the VR minute. Jeremy's not here, but he should be back next week. I think he's actually on spring break. And from what we've heard, he's playing a Rec Room with his family. So I can't wait to hear about how his entire family has fared in a VR quest. I guess the one bit of VR news I want to say is there's been a lot of social media videos of a cool hand interaction demo using the Oculus Quest and the beta for the hand gestures. And there's going to be, looks like a beta for a third-party app called Hand Physics Lab. I'll be on SideQuest next week. I'm very excited for that. That will have those demos, the weird ones where they cut off your hands and all the weird weighting stuff. So things that we've never really experienced with hand tracking before. I'm very excited to try that out. Anything you want to shout out, Will?
Hey, check out, I got streams every day on twitch.tv/notthatwillsmith. I'm playing Final Fantasy VII Remake in the morning, which is maybe the horniest video game I've ever played. And PUBG and other stuff at night at 8 Pacific. And then TechPod. Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod is out every Sunday at techpod.content.town. You can check it out there. We just did a Q&A episode last week. So we turn questions into answers and talk about things from the past. We talked a lot about the Mister this week, which I don't know if you know what that is, Norm, but it's a FPGA-based game emulation box. So instead of using software to emulate the old consoles, which is inefficient and slow, and if you remember like the old BSNES article that was untested years and years ago that Wes Fenlon wrote, it takes a hefty quad core to emulate a SNES effectively. With the FPGA, they just mimic the circuitry of the SNES, and then you slot your ROMs in, and the game just runs. And like it's down to the point that you can, like, famously the Genesis, I think, had multiple audio chips depending on which region you bought it in. So with this, you can set the hardware to emulate the audio chip that you want, so it sounds the way your Genesis sounded when you were a kid 20 years ago.
Very
and that's techpod.content.town.
awesome.
I started streaming last week too.
I saw. Holy cow! You're playing Ori.
Yeah, well, Ori is like the soundtrack of the game's really chill. And Wednesday nights I'm doing our big screen science event that I host at the Alamo normally as a benefit for their workers. Last night we did Jurassic Park, which I'm sure went super well.
Awesome.
That's on Wednesdays, and then on Fridays I stream with Trace, and we have a SciComm happy hour. And I play games every now and again.
Well, thank you both for joining me this week. I got to put a smiling baby, hopefully still smiling baby, to nap. And you, of course, as we mentioned at the top of the show, Gary Whitta's Animal Talking, it's on his Twitch as well, and maybe YouTube channel. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I'm going to pull an outro actually from the archives from 2 years ago. I've not listened to it. I think it's still running on SoundCloud, but this is from AKA Gajba. And here we go. Start. Play.
Hi there, I didn't see you. Tested. All blinking lights are cameras. Do not steal.
Tested. That's a pretty good one.
That's Jeremy.
Oh. And I'm glad I stopped the sharing. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.